I got seas going right across my deck here now. I did not run up in his vicinity, but no, I didn't. So this is Goose 2, Roger. Thanks for that information, sir, and I'll get back to you if we come up with anything, over.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name's Tanner, and I'll be joined by Taylor very shortly. Before we jump into things here, we have a few new patrons to shout out. So, a big Beyond the Breakers welcome to Roy, Kiara, Riley, Matt, and Mason. Thank you so much for joining us on Patreon. We hope you enjoy the old bonus episodes that are up there, and we have some cool new stuff coming out for you very soon. So, Taylor, how's it going?
Not too bad. Glad to be here talking about a shipwreck or maritime disaster with you today. It feels like we haven't done one in a while, but I guess it hasn't been that long. But
last one we did was the USS Turner.
The last regular one, I believe, right?
Yes, our last episode we recorded was the Battleship Potemkin episode, which highly recommend. It was a lot of fun to record. We got into some very good discussions about the movie.
I will say, as episodes go, that was one of the fun ones, like you said, to record. Obviously, if you do this long enough, they're not all bangers necessarily, but that was one that reminded me how fun podcasting can be. So it was definitely a good time.
So check it out, and some of our new patrons will be discovering that episode here, in the next couple days, hopefully, unless they're listening from the beginning, which is possible.
I always that always freaks me out a little bit. Like, what if someone just listens to like Alfaro and then they're like, "Fuck this thing"?
I don't think Alfaro is that bad. I think for
no, it's just the production quality has just come so far.
That the quality, certainly for me, my analysis of things has gotten better. Just learning more about stuff.
I'm gonna record Alfaro Taylor's version,
stripped down to its necessary parts. That'd be like the 10-year commemorative Beyond the Breakers album. It'd be kind of like a speaker box Love Below thing, where it'd be like like 10 of the best ones that each of us have written released as like a box set.
That'll partner up with like a rare side or rarities and B-sides album of just the obscure stuff we've done.
Things that I've edited together with sound clips of us talking. Speaking of media, what have you been up to recently?
Well, the most recent thing, I've kind of gotten the Fallout itch again. I've gone back into Fallout 76 and back into the wildlands of West Virginia in the nuclear holocaust.
Is that the one that's online, or is there like a campaign for that too?
So it has started out as just like online kind of thing. But they eventually realized no one actually the people that like Fallout don't want to interact with other people. They just want to be in their own little world. And they added in like a pretty standard issue campaign kind of thing to play through. I just like it because the graphics look way better than the other Fallouts, and it's just a more updated game. But it's a lot of fun. I just love the lore of Fallout in that world. It's a good time. It's like the right mixture of silly and serious, I feel like.
I liked it because I loved Skyrim, and Fallout is just Skyrim, but with different, technology and different like scenery and stuff. So I liked being able to make the switch there. I've only played Fallout 4, which everyone says is like the worst one. I wouldn't want to try one of the other ones because the amount of time that I've sunk into Fallout 4, not as much recently, but just the amount that I played it would be dangerous, I think, to have an actual better game.
Some of that comes from like the New Vegas only. They're sort of like the King James only like sect of the Fallout universe. Like they love New Vegas, and like I'll give it to them. Like New Vegas is probably the best written, most interesting, it is. There's something magical about it. That being said, it's a game from like 2006 or 7, and it feels like it nowadays when you play it. Like it just, the world feels empty. But it's still a good game. I still play New Vegas from time to time as well. I just believe there are other versions that are equally valid. Outside of that, I started a new book, Sicily 43. The First Assault on Fortress Europe by James Holland. I've been on quite a James Holland tear. I finished his Battle of Britain book. It was actually really good. I like that it delved into more than just like the air war side of things. I think when you think of the Battle of Britain, you just think of some like dogfights and stuff like that, but there's like so much more going on. And like dealing with the preparations for Operation Sea Lion and how obvious like it became eventually that Germany like just could not do this thing.
Is James Holland related at all to Tom Holland that you know of? The writer Tom Holland, not the actor.
Maybe. Let's see.
Figure both history writers with a not super common last name.
His elder brother is Tom Holland.
Okay.
So both of the Holland boys are
a Nepo brother.
Yeah, I like it though. It's not like the most academic history works that I've ever read, but like I don't always want that. Sometimes you kind of want.
I thought you were going to say accurate, like you're just reading, just made up.
No, that would be what's the guy that wrote Bomber Mafia?
I don't know.
The 10,000 Hours of Practice guy, Malcolm Gladwell.
Oh, okay,
he's
that
the one
sense.
I think that may manipulate narratives to fit what he wants them to say. Potentially,
he's the one. He's the only writer doing that.
Only guy in that game, yeah. But yeah, this book is really good. I've not gotten too far into it, but it deals a lot with like the right now we're dealing with a lot of the preparation for the invasion of Italy and all that. So it's a good time. It's not something I know a ton about, so I'm looking forward to develop that a little bit. What about you?
I'm reading a book called Nicaragua, Living in the Shadow of the Eagle. It's by Thomas W. Walker. My eyes did narrow a bit when I saw a book about Nicaragua by a guy named Walker.
Right.
Is this going to be a very biased account of the history? I just finished the book Confronting the American Dream by Michel Gobat, which was focused specifically on the years of U.S. military occupation of Nicaragua or direct U.S. interference in Nicaraguan politics.
Mm-hmm.
Like, to an extent, the U.S. has always influenced everywhere in Central America since the 1800s. But Nicaragua is a particularly like strong example of this is what American imperialism looks like, how it is played out. And so that book, Confronting the American Dream, it really didn't go much past the 1930s, because after that point, everything is done much more indirectly.
Mm-hmm.
But this book covers the time period from that book in about the first 30 or 40 pages. And then it continues into more modern history of Nicaragua to cover the era after the Sandinistas took power in 1979, and then that revolutionary government being voted out in 1990. That book, the version I have of Living in the Shadow of the Eagle is from 2003. So it doesn't include Ortega being voted back into power in 2006. But it is, I mean, that's an interesting part of history. You know, Nicaragua comes up, of course, like with the Iran-Contra affair. And so it's fun to fill in the gaps on either side of that and sort of gain a better understanding of, you know, the Somoza dictatorship over, you know, decades, most of the 20th century. And then you have the Sandinistas. And then after that, I feel like Nicaragua kind of falls off the map of discussion. But yeah, I'm enjoying it so far. I've got like 4 books going right now. But
if they had just listened to what we wanted, they could be hosting our mega prison right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they missed out on that opportunity. Let's see what else. Oh, rest in peace, Pope Francis. I think technically died yesterday, maybe.
Within 24 hours of meeting JD Vance is really what I took from that.
Yeah, I mean, Pope Francis, I mean, the Pope is a Pope. But I feel like Francis is probably the best one we'll have in our lifetime. You know, I mean, that is not saying a lot given what the Pope is and the organization that he represents.
I'm willing to put Francis up there as like a top 10 Pope ever.
But I would say Pope Francis is like, you're clearly not going to get a perfect one. So, I mean, Pope Francis is kind of the best you could hope for as a Pope, just in terms of like talking about humans like humans, talking about issues that I feel like other popes would either ignore or oppose. So I feel like you can't expect too much from that. And I feel like Pope Francis is the best we're going to have in a while.
As two non-Catholics, that is our opinion.
For what our vote counts as. Yeah, something we also talked about in the Potemkin episode of like how Catholicism, there are some really cool parts of it, especially to someone who, if you grew up with it, of course, it probably doesn't have the same, you probably, oh, this is stupid, this is silly. But I think if it is a newer thing, it's like you do kind of like, oh, this is shiny gold, the cool Virgin Mary statue. I like that there's, crucified Christ hanging all over this person's house. That is actually pretty cool. So we are going to have a story today where we will not have any Catholics. Well, probably not. I don't think we have any. Mostly Quakers in our story.
I was going to say, I think they're all Quakers, aren't they? The Catholics were in Maryland at this time.
They had spread out by this point. I mean, we let them out. Let them roam, free range Catholics.
Let them out of their Maryland prison.
So this episode, this is the first of two parts on the mutiny on the Whaleship Globe. So is this a story that you have read before?
I actually have avoided this one semi-intentionally because I figured we'd do it at some point. But I've almost read this book. What is it? What is the book called, actually? The big one right now? Is it The Mutiny on the Globe?
Well, there's two, and they both came out in 2002. But I know there were some like documents or some like archives that were uncovered and were able to be analyzed. So for this, my two main sources are Thomas Farel Heffernan's Mutiny on the Globe, The Fatal Voyage of Samuel Comstock. Heffernan's also the author of Stove by a Whale, one of the main references we used in the Essex episodes.
I'm looking at the cover. This is the one I think I've seen and almost read.
The other one, which I think is a cooler title, is Gregory Gibson's Demon of the Waters, the true story of the mutiny on the Whaleship Globe.
I don't think I've heard that one.
The Heffernan is a bit more straightforward in its narration. The Gibson one jumps around a bit more, and it kind of has a slightly different focus. It focuses a bit more on the tail end of things, with the ship Dolphin coming to get them from where they end up. An older but still useful source that we'll use in part 2 is Edwin P. Hoyt's The Mutiny on the Globe. I think that's from 1975. That was the first like full book length historical account of this story. Another big source here is the narrative of William Ley and Cyrus Hussey, who were part of the Globe's crew on her final voyage. I
just love the names of whaleship crewmen. Hussey, that's a fun.
There's a lot of Cyruses also.
Cyrus the Virus, like from Con Air.
One of these guys is a virus on the ship. Actually, one of these guys is very similar to the character of Cyrus from that. All of the sources draw from this firsthand account. And then a source I didn't use directly, but one that is mentioned in all of those sources, is a book by William Comstock titled The Life of Samuel Comstock, the Terrible Whaleman.
Oh no, another Comstock has entered the fray.
So when references are made to William or William's narrative, this is the text being referred to. This is Samuel's younger brother. Are
they first-hand source or...
William is not, but there is a younger brother than William, George.
So there's another Comstock who's actually there?
Yes.
Okay.
So there's a relatively large amount of firsthand accounting of this story. So, mutiny. What is it?
Do you want me to guess?
Sure. How would you define mutiny?
I would say, like, rebellion of a crew of a given, like, thing. Like, usurping officers and kind of creating their own separate command structure, divorced from, like, the actual powers that be.
Merriam-Webster defines mutiny as forcible or passive resistance to lawful authority, especially concerted revolt as of a naval crew against discipline or a superior officer. Example, the sailors staged a mutiny and took control of the ship. So a mutiny, Surprisingly, up to this point for a maritime themed podcast, the most we've spent discussing mutiny in a main episode is probably the Spanish Armada, when we discussed the many mutinies of the Spanish Army of Flanders, which again was on land. So, I mean, we did discuss at Scapa Flow. They can't really call that mutiny. There were some mutinous elements there. We've kind of touched on some of the mutinous energy in the German Navy on a wider scale. But we really haven't looked at a true mutiny at sea on a main episode.
Yeah, just through movies is really the main way we've interacted with
it.
it.
The Bounty, we talked about it.
Potemkin.
Hunt for Red October, though that's, as the source material would indicate, that is technically an act of barratry rather than mutiny. So, quoting here from the introduction of Richard Woodman's A Brief History of Mutiny.
The mariner's environment is a hermetic one, misunderstood by those unfamiliar with its subtleties, yet easily subverted by oversimplified assumptions. A ship's crew are employed for a specific purpose, and there are usually just enough of them for that purpose to be accomplished. Destroy a part, and you destroy the whole.
The very act of mutiny, therefore, requires a motivation strong enough to set aside its consequences, for the risk the mutineer runs goes beyond retribution on the part of the usurped authority. The mutineers have to outwit the dangers of the sea and conduct their little world somewhere safe or sympathetic.
To do so, they must act in harmony, and harmony was scarcely a quality to be found among men confronting constitutional authority, no matter how tyrannical. The outcomes of mutinies were often as appalling as their causes.
So, jumping into the background of our story here today, we won't go into nearly as much detail about whaling itself. We covered most of that on the Essex series, and most of the stuff, this is a very similar time in history. This is also a Nantucket whaling ship. Most of the stuff has been covered already. If you want to go back and listen to episode 118, which was a 2 or 3 part series on the Essex.
I can't remember. It might have been 3.
I think it was 3.
But also we watched the movie, so that might have been the 3rd one. I don't know.
So the Globe will have a lot in common with Essex in terms of overall operation. There's a few differences in how her story plays out. Because they left a long first-hand account of the story, William Ley and Cyrus Hussey's perspective will be very prevalent here, as it is with any of the books on this.
Yeah, I feel like having that background from the Essex, like you kind of know a lot about these people already, kind of like who they are, what they're about, that very strong like Quaker influence that they have on them. And also like these are all people who have known they were going to be whalers from probably like the time they were old enough to think about working.
Bit of review here just to sort of set the time period we'll be talking about here. Nantucket, as we discussed in part 1 of the Essex, the Nantucket whaling fleet suffered pretty badly during both wars between the United States and Britain, the Revolution, and the War of 1812. In addition to the ravages of the War of 1812, which could be fairly quickly replaced with new ships, we also talked in part 2 of the Essex about how Nantucket was actually in the process of falling behind other whaling ports, places like New Bedford, largely due to the fact that these newer, larger whaling vessels with all the try-works and stuff on board, they were just getting too big to enter the harbor at Nantucket. The harbor was kind of starting to silt up a bit. So this is about the time, 1815, 1820. This is about the time when Nantucket is losing its primacy of place as one of these whaling ports, as kind of the capital of the U.S. whaling industry. The main character is typically considered to be Samuel Comstock, and we will follow that trend here. Samuel Comstock was born on Nantucket in 1802, the oldest of 3 boys who would be born to Nathan Comstock. Nathan had been a newcomer to the island. We're definitely not dealing with one of those Nantucket elite families like we talked about with the Essex, the Folgers, the Coffins, the Chases, the Starbucks.
I think that was something that was really interesting that we talked about before, is how you could even be one of those families, and if you had had the misfortune of being born, where was the one person born? On a different one of the other islands.
If you were born on like Cape Cod, in some of these cases, it's like you could be literally just just across that little stretch of water, and that was like being
You were still kind of an other.
At the ends of the earth, as it related to Nantucketers. Yeah, like if you were from the wrong branch of the family, you basically didn't count. Or if you married out, that's what we talked about with Matthew Joy and the Essex. If you married someone who wasn't a Quaker, you've sort of lost that coveted status on the island. A bit more on the family here from Thomas Farel Heffernan.
The Comstock boys came from rugged stock. They were in the 8th generation of a family brought to America in the 17th century from Wales or Devonshire. Reports vary. By patriarch Samuel Comstock, whose first name was popular through generations of the family. The first Comstock settlement was near Watertown, Massachusetts. Subsequent locations were in Wethersford and New London, Connecticut. And finally, in Burrillville, Rhode Island. The family was to typify, generation by generation, the classic American progress from primitive colonial settlement to prosperous urban capitalism. The stage reached by the father of the mutineer.
That will be an interesting thing here that we'll get into with Nathan Comstock is, you mentioned we focused a lot on the tradition, the whaling tradition, about all these kids being raised to do like what their fathers did, to go out whaling. And we actually don't see that here.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Probably because Nathan Comstock is not a native Nantucketer. The family is not a whaling family per se. And so we'll kind of see a more peripheral side of this community here. Nathan Comstock arrived on Nantucket in the late 1790s, around the age of 20, beginning work as a school teacher in July of 1800 at the Quaker Monthly Meeting School, earning $200 for a 6-month contract, which was renewed the following term. $200 for a 6-month contract, that is not too different from what my first teaching internship was. But so he's a school teacher. So throughout this, obviously they're living on Nantucket. He's teaching at a Quaker school. Later, we'll see Samuel attending Quaker schools. I don't think the Comstock family were Quakers.
Okay.
It doesn't seem that they were, but it seems that, as we'll see here, if you are operating in this world of Nantucket, even if you aren't a Quaker, you sort of essentially have to play one to be part of the game. I guess in a way we could say that Nantucket is like a little Ottoman Empire where you can get quite high in society, even if you aren't part of the ruling clique per se. But you will sort of be marked as different. But hey, you can get up pretty high. You can be successful.
Just don't rock the boat too much.
Less chance of being beheaded on Nantucket, but you could be socially shunned, which to some people might be worse. So another interesting thing about Nathan Comstock, he was a teacher. He also worked as a bank cashier during this time. So never stop grinding is the lesson here. It says bank cashier. I assume that's a bank teller is what that means. Is that the same thing?
I would imagine. I don't know what is. I don't even know what a bank looks like at this time. I would imagine it's definitely different than our current banking system, where you walk up to the window.
They said, "How come I never see you at the wharf?" And I said, "How come I never see you at the bank?" He's working at the bank. He's on his grind, apparently doing quite well. So despite his status, though, as an off-islander, Nathan Comstock quickly made influential friends, most notably in the form of Edward T. Emmett, who was married into the affluent ship-owning Mitchell family.
I feel like if you're an off-islander, but you just show up and do a job that no one else is doing, and you do it well and don't cause any trouble, they'll probably accept you pretty quickly. Right.
I mean, you look at some of those sort of traditional Quaker values of,
hard work and
don't make a fuss, do good work, and you'll be accepted into Quaker society.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think it's interesting, Comstock being able to arrive and so quickly get in with a pretty influential family. Maybe a preview of one of his oldest son's skills that we'll see later.
So a little charisma in this family.
Although it seems that Nathan's was a bit more pure than Samuel's will be. Nathan would marry Edward Emmett's daughter Elizabeth in 1801, and the aforementioned Samuel was born the following year. In 1811, the Comstocks moved to New York City for Nathan's next business venture in the whaling industry. But actually, a couple years before this, Samuel had already been sent away to Nine Partners School in Dutchess County, New York, in what is today Millbrook, New York.
That sounds like a horrible place to be sent to.
I was looking on the map here. Dutchess County, the seat of Dutchess County is Poughkeepsie,
Okay.
and so it's a little bit north of New York City. Also, weird. Dutchess County is spelled. It's like an archaic spelling of Dutchess, so there's no T in Dutchess. It looks wrong.
Weird. That is weird.
This Nine Partners School. This would not be the only school that Samuel attended, for reasons that we'll see. Lots of reasons. Sometimes when someone becomes notorious for a crime they committed, they'll interview friends and family, and they're like, "Oh, I'm shocked. This isn't him at all. Like I can't imagine that they would do something like this.
Uh-huh.
I never would have seen this coming." Samuel, it kind of seems retrospectively like he was always going to become infamous as a mutineer.
Uh-huh.
Like if you asked one of his childhood friends, "Hey, this guy's going to be famous for mutiny," he'd be like, "Yeah, that
makes sense.
That sounds right." Extrapolating from the years I knew him, I thought this was interesting. Apparently, even before Samuel was born, his mother predicted that the baby she was carrying would be, quote, "a person of extraordinary but ill-directed energies."
Uh-oh.
That's the kind of thing I would write. That's the kind of like feedback that I give to students usually. Modern teaching, there's no bad students. It's, students that need to direct their energy better in a more focused way, in a way that's more productive. As a kid, Samuel was quite difficult to control, as Heffernan highlights here.
Samuel did, in fact, turn out to be a good learner in the course of a fragmented and erratic education. But he had to learn his own way. His days in successive schools were contests in which the schools almost always came out losers, and Samuel a winner.
From his last recorded schooling at the age of 16, he retired virtually undefeated. William describes one of the Nine Partners schoolmasters, Mark Coffin, taking out his knife to trim a switch for use on the misbehaving Samuel.
As he did so, the 6-year-old's world-weary words to the schoolmaster were, "Ah, friend Mark, it will be of no use. Father has used up a whole poplar tree on me, but to no purpose."
Little asshole. But like in a funny way.
Uh-huh. This kid clearly has ADHD.
Well, it's interesting there, because it says, Samuel he turned out to be a good learner in the course of a fragmented and erratic education. It is one of those things where, so, the kid is having behavioral problems, so you move him to a different school, and you keep doing that, and you say, "Oh, well, he doesn't fit anywhere." It's like, well, if you leave him at one place, maybe that would help. Maybe that is the problem.
Yeah, he just gets to win and move on to a new challenger.
If you're presenting this as, well, education is just interchangeable, one place is as good as another, why would he value the school you've chosen for him? Also, it's a bit like in the NFL when you have a high draft pick quarterback and it's a bad team, say, I don't know, a team, the Schmeveland Browns or something.
Uh-huh.
And it's a bad team, so they have bad players around this high draft pick, so they fire the head coach one year, and then they fire the GM the next year, and then he's got a new offensive coordinator, and then it's like, well, this quarterback is clearly a failure. There are other factors in play here. Also, a nice little view into like Quaker culture, the fact that he addresses his teacher as a 6-year-old, he addresses him as friend Mark.
Yeah. I feel like that would get your ass beat extra at most prep schools.
I think I forgot to add this to the notes. This is just an interesting sidebar. At this school, at the Nine Partners School, there was I don't believe they were ever technically classmates.
Uh-huh.
But I think about 9 years his senior was a student named Lucretia Coffin.
Uh-huh.
And I think by the time that Samuel was there, she was working as like an assistant teacher in the school. Lucretia Coffin, who we mentioned in the Essex episode, would become much more famous under her married name, Lucretia Mott.
Interesting.
In the abolition and women's suffrage movements. So a little crossover there. The Quaker world is relatively small.
Yeah, I guess then they're all so productive.
Yeah.
They're like the original Mormons.
Hey, maybe in some ways, but definitely not in others. They're a lot cooler than the Mormons, I think.
That's true. It's true. Ooh, power rank.
Let's rank religions.
This would be a great podcast. Power rank the Protestant faiths. Go.
We'll just do that on this episode and then watch our ratings tank. And it's like, overall, the show's pretty good, but there's one episode where they just stopped the story and they started ranking every religion out of a scale of 20.
Everybody hated it.
So when the rest of the Comstock family moved to New York City, Nathan set up his business at 191 Front Street in the middle of the city's whale oil center.
The whale oil district.
Which I don't think New York still has. It was actually interesting because I don't know New York like at all. I went there once to Manhattan in like sophomore year.
We went to the important part of New York is what you're saying. Manhattan.
The 9/11 memorial.
There was no memorial. It was a hole in the ground when we went there.
The real memorial. It was kind of interesting looking at the modern New York and then looking at some of the older historical maps to see how much a lot of these streets have changed.
Mm-hmm.
They've been rerouted. There's different stuff there, of course. So the family moved into a home on Market Street, actually just a few blocks south of the 5 Points area, like where if you've ever seen Gangs of New York, that is the setting. It would still be another decade or so before you have the advent of the classic Gangs of New York gangs, your Dead Rabbits, your 40 Thieves, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
The Plug Uglies, my favorite from the movie.
They're all just coalescing right now.
Sort of. And actually, thinking about the math here, this is the early 1800s. Gangs of New York is set in the 1860s, most of it. So theoretically, Bill the Butcher could have been one of these kids that Samuel's running around with.
That's true. One of the little, wharf children.
So Comstock was able to find plenty of trouble with his own group of fellow miscreants.
He was 9 when he joined and became a leader of a group of neighborhood boys who had christened themselves the Downtowners. Night after night, Samuel, carrying his big homemade wooden shield and wearing his coat of mail, sneaked out of the house to rendezvous with the Downtowners and meet in battle the rough boys from the shipbuilding area of Corler's Hook.
The scars on his arms and legs stayed with him all his life. William returned to the subject of the juvenile gang wars in his novelette, Mysteries of New York, where his account of a conflict between the Downtowners and the Corler's Hookers, aided by their allies from other gangs, reads like battlefield reporting. The armies grow to numbers in the hundreds.
When the Downtowners chase a group of Corler's Hookers who had locked themselves in a deserted house, the leader of the pursuing group orders his lads to break off a rotting pillar from the piazza and use it as a battering ram to break down the front door.
Have you seen Gangs of New York?
A long time ago, and I don't know that I saw all of it, but that's definitely one of those I need to watch.
This is like the opening battle from Gangs of New York. They got these weapons. It's like everyone's got their homemade flails and bill hooks, and they're wearing armor. That is exactly like how this movie opens.
When I say make America great again.
This is what we mean. Except a lot of this violence was probably directed at immigrants. So
some of it was done by...
Some of it, yes, this is true.
In organized defense.
Some of it was done by Liam Neeson, by John C. Reilly. Brendan Gleeson. Samuel was soon moved out of the Pearl Street School, that's where he was in New York, and back to the Nine Partners School. But soon after that, he was transferred again to a school on Long Island.
That had to be rural at the time, I would imagine. They've sent
I think
him
relatively
out to the country.
so. They sent him out to the Hamptons. I don't think it was in the Hamptons. That would have been a huge trip at the time. Comstock's first experience at sea would come in 1816. Through his father's business connections, he was able to sign on at the ripe age of 13 as a green hand on Josiah Macy's Liverpool trader Edward. Heffernan notes that the owner of the ship did take some convincing, likely due to a combination of this kid is 13 and I've heard about this kid. Maybe a mix of his age and his reputation. But again, I mean, Quaker society here is all about who you know and the connections you have. So enough people vouch, for him and say, hey, maybe it'll do the kid some good. Maybe that's exactly what this kid needs. Maybe he needs to be locked on a boat for a few months to either cool his jets or learn some useful skills. Important to note, this is a merchant. This is a trader. This is not a whaling ship.
Right. Yeah, it's a very different environment.
That was kind of the two options if you wanted to go to sea at the time, especially as a Quaker. You could go into the merchant trade or you could be a whaler. As we'll see later, the Navy isn't really an option for Quakers for one of the basic pillars of Quaker society, the nonviolence. On those Essex episodes, we talked about how young many of these sailors and whalers are at the time, but 13 is extremely young, even for the time, to be signing on. On the Essex, I think Thomas Nickerson, the cabin boy, I think he was 14. And that was just as a cabin boy. He's not really doing any of the actual whaling. So yeah, 13 is, even for the time, that's quite young. Although, didn't we see, was it the Lusitania episode where the captain, he started sailing at like 12?
Yeah.
Heffernan suggests that young Comstock would not have been entrusted by his father to just any old sea captain.
Nathan probably put his son in the care of Captain Macy with the same feelings he would have had enrolling him under a good teacher. For Josiah Macy was a moral force. He was devout, generous, solicitous about his men, temperate, and decorous. He had never been heard to utter a curse in the course of his 22 years of command, and his men avoided curses in his presence. Macy was very successful as a ship owner and a captain, bold in defying the War of 1812 blockaders, and endlessly resourceful in trading cargo in difficult and unlikely ports. But the strongest impression left by his own autobiography and the testimony of others is that of an upright and kindly man.
I think that's an interesting glimpse, too, at the idea that, the Quakers of Nantucket, they don't have to sit out the war necessarily just because they can't fight. Him serving in this blockade running capacity is really interesting. So Samuel Comstock's first experience seems to have gone smoothly enough. Maybe this new adventure occupied his energies enough that he didn't really have the chance to goof off.
It's like when you take a dog out and exercise it properly, and it just gets all the energy out, then it goes to sleep.
Treat your children like a dog.
Absolutely.
Wilkie is a bit like that right now. He's in his sort of long teen phase.
He looks like a biter.
He's either asleep or running around or eating, but he has no halfway mode. After some time back home, Samuel signed on for his second voyage, this time on John Jacob Astor's vessel, the Beaver. So Titanic fans, this one's for you. This John Jacob Astor is the great-grand... Who am I kidding? The Titanic fans probably already know this. They probably already know the Astor family tree to 20 generations. This John Jacob Astor is the great-grandfather of John Jacob Astor IV, who famously died in the sinking of the Titanic. This is also the Astor who originally came to the United States from Germany. And he made his fortune in two things that are not really acceptable anymore. The fur trade, so boo, and the opium trade to China.
Wow, okay.
As in the Opium Wars, we're talking here.
Boo. This is the original fentanyl from China right here.
Really is. This is exactly what it is. I don't know what cargo they thought they were carrying. I don't think it was opium. I think the sources would have mentioned that. Or, I don't know why they would have been... What opium would they have been carrying with them from Nantucket to to China? It was to China that Comstock and the crew of the Beaver thought they were sailing when they signed on in June of 1817. However, and we're going to go back to somewhere we go occasionally on the show, they were surprised to find that they were in fact sailing for Talcahuano, Chile.
Uh-oh.
Yes, and the year is 1817. That's important. with about $140,000 worth of munitions for Chile's then raging War of Independence from Spain.
Interesting.
I'd like to read more about, presumably that's Alastair being in on this. It's his ship, so he probably knows what's going on here. I'd like to read more about that.
I would be shocked that one of these like old school millionaire families started via less than
Gun running,
above board things. I would be shocked. Not in my America.
When the ship was stopped and her cargo confiscated by the Spanish Navy, it meant several months in captivity for Comstock and the crew.
Do you think there were some of the crew that were legit like, what? Wait, no.
Definitely. I'm sure, especially the new people saw. Well, we saw this with the what was the vessel, the one that was being built for the Confederacy, and then it ended up being used in.
I'm blanking on the name.
Very similar thing where people sign on for a job and they realize, oh, we're being offloaded at the Faroe Islands. What? And so similar thing here. So the crew is imprisoned, although there's mention of leave being granted for men to go into town. It doesn't seem like this was particularly brutal confinement. I think probably because they're all Americans and Spain doesn't want to antagonize the United States.
It's more like you're detained, but just no funny business.
Basically, it seems like there was a relative amount of freedom there. While in Talcahuano, the Beaver's mate, Nathaniel Bunker, told Comstock of his plan to sign on with the whaler George, which was currently in the same port.
Are they like jumping ship in port?
I assume that their contract expired when they got arrested.
That's true.
For gun running. So I assume they were no longer under contract. Comstock decides to go along and he gets his first experience on a whaler, but not really his first experience with whaling, because this is on the George's journey back to Nantucket.
Mm-hmm.
And Comstock never lowered into the whaleboats for a whale on this trip. Quoting here from Heffernan.
Lowering or not, Samuel's stint on the George introduced him to life on a whaler. The experience had an effect on him that he was not ready for. He came to hate whale ships and their officers with an intensity that he never got over. That this is what Williams reports, and there is evidence that Samuel meant what he told his brother, and no contradiction to it in the fact that he was to serve on 2 other whalers after the George.
I think that's something that's worth repeating here, and some of these quotes, they allude directly to it, is a good portion of what we know about Samuel's career and also his outlook about things comes from his brother's narrative.
Uh-huh.
So there certainly is an element. There's certain things that William really has control over in the narrative in terms of how Samuel is going to be presented. In terms of, his attitude, his personality, some of those things that can't really be independently verified. So whether that's a matter of, they're spicing up the adventure or making certain things Samuel says seem a bit more directly prophetic than maybe they actually were. So I think it's just something worth remembering that like this one person kind of has a bottleneck on what we know about his brother. The George arrived back in Nantucket in July of 1818, and that fall, Samuel Comstock turned 16. He went back to school, but by next year he was asking his father to go to sea again.
The children yearn for the sea.
His father insisted that if he were to sail again, it must be on a whale ship, which seems a bit counterintuitive. I would feel like as a parent, you would prefer them to be on a merchant ship.
Yeah, that is kind of weird considering how it is known how dangerous whale ships are.
That whale ship would be the brand new 317-ton Foster, captained by Shubael Chase. Quoting here from Heffernan.
There was something out of character about Samuel's compliance with his father's wishes in the matter, and something equally out of character about Samuel's compliance with his father's advice to get a new coat to wear to Nantucket. It should be a Quaker coat, Nathan said, and Samuel bought one. He was signing up for work that he hated, wearing clothes that he hated. He could overlook his clothes and even his work. Other things claimed his attention.
So I don't know if it comes up in my notes here, but Nathan Comstock, so his business, we said it was in the whale oil center. So he basically works in the whale oil trade, selling whale oil, but he also works with outfitting the whale ships. So Samuel Chase has grown up with a knowledge of the whaling industry, and now he is getting the first-hand experience. The Foster sailed from Nantucket on July 22nd, 1819, scheduled to be gone for 33 months. We mentioned the bigger whaling ships. Of course, that correlates with longer trips. We're going to see them sail to Japan here. So, no longer can you just sail out into the Atlantic and get whales. Those have already been hunted. They're gone.
We killed those whales.
With the Essex, we talked about how the offshore ground just off of South America had just been discovered. And so these are just getting progressively longer and longer and longer trips. And so, yeah, this one's scheduled to be about 3 years that they're going to be gone.
I think what's so wild when you think about human interaction, how humans live, like imagine being gone from home for 3 years and you basically have no way to communicate with anyone back home. You think that sounds really like crazy and insane, but for like 99% of human existence, this is much more the norm. It kind of makes you wonder if, like, you start thinking about the effects of being instantly reachable all the time through social media and how different that is than this. And just how different, like, relationships are with people because of these things.
Yeah, I mean, now it's like a fairly common, I mean, depending on the person and depending on your relationship with them. But, if you don't hear back from them in an hour, it's, what's going on? Like, yeah. And like here, and obviously you're in port occasionally. So, you might be able to correspond by mail. But again, that's it. You would probably be lucky to do that more than one time a year.
But maybe you see another boat that came out after you that has some news from home.
Yeah.
We talked about that being a thing, that you would see other boats from the Northeast when you're out there. But yeah, that's just something I thought about is how differently like time passes.
Well, and also in the case of Samuel Comstock and what's going to happen in this story is you look at the years that those 3 years are in his life. He leaves as a 16-year-old. When you're 16, you are still legally a child, and you come back and you're 19. Now, certainly when you are 19, you feel like a full-grown adult.
Right.
You do still have growing to do, but 19 is significantly different developmentally from 16. And to spend those years...
I want to cut that clip out in isolation, by the way, just that one bit.
It is significantly different.
No context.
Statute 48B clearly says...
This is now a libertarian podcast.
And yeah, to spend those years from 16 to 19, not, working a day job, not at school, the people you are interacting with who are the same age are in the same position as you. So it's like those are very critical 3 years to be spending in this situation.
Even the idea of like you're not punching a clock. You're not in a factory or somewhere, working a piecemeal job. Like you're kind of just always working.
I mean, you mentioned like with the mobile thing, how you're always connected. It's like that's one of the things now with work. It's like depending on your job, you're kind of always connected to work. If I get a work message on Teams, I see that even if I'm at home, even if I'm not going to respond to it, it's there and it's present. And kind of the same thing here, where if you are living on your floating workplace, it's like you're kind of always at work.
Yeah.
And certainly if there's an emergency situation, if the captain says you need to do something, this is before the days of union protections for you. So if the captain orders you to do something when you're, quote unquote, off the clock, it's like, well, you're going to do it. I mean, there is another option, though, that we'll see.
We'll talk about that.
Foster returned on April 12th, 1822, but not to Nantucket. Foster offloaded her 1,624 barrels of sperm oil in Edgartown on Martha's Vineyard. We mentioned that silt buildup in Nantucket's harbor. It led many returning vessels, full of oil, to offload their cargo on Martha's Vineyard instead.
That's not good for Nantucket.
No, it's not. I'm sure they're still seeing some of that business, but probably not all of it anymore. Well, William noted distinct changes in his brother's appearance upon his return to Nantucket.
His face and neck were nearly as black as an Indian's, while there was nothing left in his eyes of the frank and open expression that characterized them. There was a deep, subtle, and mysterious expression about them, which I thought very repulsive. His sister noticed the change and remarked to me that he had a bad look. His manner, however, was not like his appearance. There seemed to be no shyness or reserve, no feeling of conscious guilt in his soul. He was as cordial, bold, and reckless as ever, and seemed to feel himself particularly at home.
Nantucketers are very dramatic when someone gets a tan.
I think the thing that strikes me here is this somewhat checks out in the sense that we kind of heard this in the opposite in the Essex, talking about the younger kids going out for their first time and seeing how different these men were that they'd grown up with. These are guys that are like uncles and, father figures to them, and they've never seen them at sea, and just seeing how different they are and how kind of vulgar and vile they can be at sea.
Yeah, these guys, these respected members of the community that like you've seen at the Quaker Meeting House on Sundays, and you've seen them at events and celebrations and stuff, and then to see those same people cussing and swearing and ramming a spear into the brain of a sperm whale as it spouts gore upon them, like it is a different experience. And yeah, like you said here, this is seeing a brother, a family member come back physically, very different. And again, that's 3 years from 16 to 19. There's going to be a lot of just normal, regular physical growth going on.
And not to mention being in such a combative environment where you're probably having to scrap in some sort of way most days to get by. It's not a very forgiving environment that you're doing this growing in. I mean, there's probably a lot of parallels you could draw to someone coming back from World War I or the Civil War, the War of 1812, and how, trauma changes people.
So during his time at home, he shared plenty of his stories with William, who would later publish them in his narrative of Samuel's life as a whaler. Among these stories were some that clearly would raise some red flags for Samuel's next and what would be his final whaling voyage. One of these stories involved Samuel's violent fantasies of flogging the ship's mate. It's something that, I'm sure sailors throughout history have imagined getting revenge on a particularly cruel mate.
I mean, I think even if it's not a particular mate, it's even just like sometimes the concept of, right, that like anything that can hold arbitrary power over you, you probably have a little bit of that revenge fantasy, right?
He shared his ideas with two of his shipmates who lacked the enthusiasm to go along with his plans, if plans, quote unquote, even existed beyond just, idle chatter about this.
See, that's the real problem, is that sometimes these are just inside thoughts and you got to keep them to yourself.
He was on the FBI's radar. This is one of those things where, you could say that and kind of see what happens, see if anyone else seems enthusiastic and then decide what to do from there.
Like, oh, I'm just kidding. But really, what if?
Yeah, but seriously.
But I'm just joking.
Samuel did not pursue the matter further at that time. He did, however, apparently ask Captain Chase to let him off the ship on Easter Island in pursuit of a grander overarching fantasy. Quoting here from Heffernan.
For a long time, he had been contemplating what it would be like to live for the rest of his life as the only white man among the natives of a Pacific island. He was sure that he would quickly be elected king. Once in power, he would make the island a pirate kingdom, launching a native navy that would capture every vessel in sight.
His exploits would turn him into a fable. He would gain immortality as the terror of the South Seas. He even, at one point in the Voyage of the Foster, tried to get started on establishing his kingdom.
Resourceless as he was, he asked Captain Chase to put him ashore at Easter Island. Samuel would take it from there. The captain naturally refused, assuming no doubt that he was saying no to a discharge request, while in fact he was saying no to a delusion. That is very manic.
Yeah, definitely. It's stuff like that where it's the kind of wild fantasy you might have, but not tell anyone about. Certainly not the captain.
Although he would have loved is it Christmas Island? Christmas Islands? Is that where the bounty people end up?
Pitcairn Island.
Pitcairn Islands. He'd that would have been more his speed, maybe. Maybe he could have made something out of that.
Oh yeah, I think he would have done well on Pitcairn Island. A den of mutiny and incest. So after getting home this time, Samuel claimed he was retiring from whaling for good. electing to work as a clerk for his father's business. Predictably, he got sick of that job. He doesn't seem much like a clerk. He craved more adventure at sea, although not on a whaler. It was the Navy that had his attention now.
Interesting.
And he nearly was able to sign on with a Patriot frigate bound for the independence wars in Latin America.
That doesn't sound good. That doesn't sound like something you should be part of.
Well, I mean, Patriot frigate, the word Patriot's kind of poisoned, I guess, in the modern U.S., but these are frigates that are going to join the independence struggles, so like to fight against Spain. So I guess you could call that a noble cause.
I'll take it.
So although his father initially gave permission, social pressure from Quaker society quickly forced him to rescind his blessing, the vessel being a ship of war. And Nathan refused to pay for any of the equipment Samuel would need. So this is why, again, I don't know for sure, but I do not think that they were Quakers, because, again, he initially says, yes, I don't think any Quaker family would do that.
Right, but
it is the pressure, which, again, like I said at the beginning, is even if you aren't a Quaker family, you essentially have to behave like one if you want to exist in this society in any capacity.
Probably even more so, because you can probably overlook a little bit, like if you're Quaker to Quaker, maybe you got your own skeletons, but like they don't owe you anything.
Yeah, so this is an interesting sort of change of heart where Nathan, on the one hand, yeah, he wants to find something good for his son, but on the other, he's a businessman and he cannot have that business threatened by agreeing to this. Also really shows how seriously the Quakers took the nonviolence thing, saying, no, we won't even do business with this person if they allow their son to go do something like this. With this avenue closed, Samuel suddenly appeared to have a change of heart. He would return to whaling after all, which is
the thing he hates.
Easy to say in retrospect, but it is pretty suspicious how quickly he changes his mind. Hoping to ensure Samuel's best possible behavior on this voyage, Nathan promised his son that if he completed his next job successfully, this next voyage, he would finance the purchase of his very own whaling ship.
That is some Nepo baby shit right there.
It is, and it also indicates how successful Nathan Comstock is in his business ventures.
Bribing your kid to be good on this voyage, and like you'll buy him a ship.
I'll give you a whale ship. I mean, yeah, this is like, I guess the equivalent today would be like, if you graduate high school, I'll buy you a Ferrari. But yeah, this shows that Nathan Comstock's business is doing really well if he can just personally say, well, yeah, I'll buy you a whale ship. This would bring Samuel Comstock onto the whaleship Globe. There doesn't seem to be any particular reason he chose the Globe, aside from it just being in Nantucket at the time and having a boat steerer's berth open. And this is something we've talked about before, but kind of the progression here was these voyages are so long and so intensive. You get so much experience just on a single voyage that after 3 voyages, you're basically in position where you can kind of be contending for first mate, if not a captaincy on one of these. You learn fast in this job. So even though we wouldn't look at him and say, oh, he's a super experienced whaler, he's really only had one full whaling voyage. He is qualified for this boat steerer's position, which is an officer position.
Is that, I can't remember, is that like the bottom, like, is that like the bottom level officer?
Essentially, the boat steerer, when we're talking about that's referring to like the whale boat itself. The boat steerer is going to be one of your harpooners. So he's got his own oar at the front. And then when the whale is in sight, he's going to pick up the harpoon. So he's arguably the most important position in the whale boats because he's got to hit with that harpoon.
Is that boat steer position on the whaleboat filled by an officer? Is that what each mate and captain does?
No, it's usually different people. The mate or the captain's typically at the back of the boat.
Okay.
Guiding the boat.
Okay.
Whereas the boat steerer is the one who's going to be throwing your harpoon. And then in a very bizarre setup, typically they would switch places for the mate or the captain to make the actual killing blow with the lance. Not a lot of space to be doing this. As you have this line running out, you've got all kinds of like tools and stuff sitting in this boat. But yeah, they got very, very adept at this. And we did see on the Essex where at one point, if the harpooner, if your boat steerer is not hitting with the harpoon, this is a very important skill that we need to be able to do. So not out of the question for the captain or the mate to basically bench the harpooner and say, no, I'll do it.
Uh-huh.
There's one other boat steerer on the globe here. Quoting here from Heffernan.
He returned at once to New York to prepare for the voyage. He packed a chest with items that would have made no sense to an ordinary seaman. Pistols, daggers, swords, powder and ball, a case of surgical instruments, a medicine chest, and garden seeds, but that were provisions for the kingdom to be. The garden seeds were for the introduction of agriculture on the chosen island.
So this reminds me a bit of like, you know, in like a TV show or something when like a kid wants to run away from home and he packs like comic books and chocolate bars in his backpack. Oh yeah, that's probably everything I'll need.
Yeah, it does feel very like not thought out. Like for all you know, the seeds you're bringing aren't going to grow on whatever island you end up on. Like it does seem very like childlike and like that. Oh, I'll just go figure this out.
Kind of shows the primacy of violence in his worldview. I mean, most of the things listed there are weapons. Saying, oh, this is most of what I'll need, right? But Samuel wasn't leaving on the globe by himself. The youngest Comstock brother, 14-year-old George, would accompany him on this voyage. To our ship itself. Construction on the globe most likely began in February of 1815. With the war concluded, it was now safe to be putting more ships back on the water. And from the beginning, the Globe was a very successful ship. On her very first voyage, she set a record for a haul of more than 2,000 barrels of oil. She was the first whaler to do that, or at least the first Nantucket whaler to do that. On her second voyage, in 1818, she was the first whaler to stumble upon the offshore ground west of Peru, teeming with whales, one of which would very soon sink the Essex.
I was going to say, I know that place.
And so that's another circle back to the Essex, where we had said that offshore ground had just been discovered. That's not where they were sailing for. They heard about that as they're in Peru. So, oh, we discovered this new place, and it's the Globe that finds it. The Globe's third voyage was also successful, lasting from 1820 to 1822. And all the Globe's voyages up to this point had been under Captain George Washington Gardner. For his success, Gardner had just been rewarded with the captaincy of a new, larger ship called the Maria. Command of the Globe would fall to 29-year-old Thomas Worth, Gardner's first mate on the previous voyage. Going back to Richard Woodman here in his brief history of mutiny, he writes the following about Thomas Worth.
Worth turned a deaf ear to rumors of Comstock's tendency to ride the men in his watch with acts of petty tyranny. Worth himself was not a harsh commander, though he was prepared to take a rope's end to a man if he deemed it necessary. Indeed, the only complaint of any substance against him seems to have been on his tendency not to let men have a proper meal period. A small matter to landsmen, but of crucial importance in a monotonous voyage, which often lasted as long as 4 years. Writing home, Second Mate Lumbert spoke of Worth as a fine man, but he was apt to take matters into his own hands and manhandle recalcitrant seamen who were slow to obey orders. I could see messing with the meals being a thing. I mean, it's kind of like what you hear with like U-boats, right? Like, or submarines in general. Like, hey, the food is at least good, and you get some time to enjoy it.
It is, and it's like, again, like not having done like a super, super huge amount of reading on a wider array of whaling captains, it seems like a weird one thing for the captain to have a problem with. That seems like something that would be like low on a list of other things the captain does wrong. Mm-hmm. Whereas like just the not giving them enough time to eat seems, maybe it's, I assume, at least superficially, a wanting to get guys back to work. I don't know. It seems like an odd one hang up for a captain to have.
Yeah, it really does. Like, I don't know if it's just a control thing or what. If you're leaning, you should be cleaning, you know, like that kind of an attitude.
When Worth took over, the Globe was in need of some refitting. And it was during this maintenance work at Nantucket that the Comstock boys arrived to join the crew. When this work was completed, the Globe made a short hop over to Martha's Vineyard. Martha's Vineyard! Made a short hop over to Martha's Vineyard for final provisioning at Edgartown.
Special guest Mark Wahlberg with us today. This mutiny would have gone differently if he was on board the Globe.
If I'd been on the Essex, it wouldn't have gone down like it did.
He's going to fight the whale.
There would have been a lot of blood in that ocean. Well, there was a lot of blood in that ocean, but there would have been more. Different blood. Vietnamese blood, probably.
I was waiting for it.
That's not funny. Mark Wahlberg committed a hate crime. The Globe set out on her fourth voyage on December 20th, 1822, after a few days of adverse weather. Captained again by Thomas Worth, and with William Beadle, aged 26, as first mate. Both men also hailed from Martha's Vineyard. Of those 21 who began the voyage, 11 were from Martha's Vineyard.
Wow.
That's Captain Worth and First Mate Beadle, Second Mate John Lumbert, Third Mate Nathaniel Fisher, Boat Steerer Gilbert Smith, and 6 of the seamen on board. That's Stephen Kidder and his brother Peter, Columbus Worth, a cousin of the captain, Roland Jones, John Cleveland, and Constant Lewis.
Do you know, are any of these people... I know we talked about how diverse the crew actually is when we talked about the Essex. Are there any like African Americans or anything like anyone unique in this mix? Like I know there was an Englishman on the Essex.
So actually, yes, on the crew manifest that Captain Worth put together before leaving, it lists names, place of birth, place of residence, country, age, height, complexion, and hair. Your choices of complexion are fair, light, dark, and mulatto.
Oh.
Dark, in this case, is indicating, I am assuming, more like swarthiness. But yes, there are... Let's see, I think I have it on my list here. It's not the most diverse crew. It's not quite as diverse as the Essex crew. In terms of place of origin, though, 5... Well, in some sources, you see 5... coming from Nantucket. That's only if you include the Comstocks, which I think certainly Nantucketers probably wouldn't.
Right.
You know, they had lived there and didn't anymore. So Samuel Comstock, his brother George, who could just as easily be considered from New York, given that's where their family was based now. I guess you could call them the real Nantucketers, were the Couper, Cyrus Hussey, assistant Couper, Roland Coffin, and the 14-year-old cabin boy, John Ignatius Pross. Pross is interesting, an interesting story. Pross's family had apparently immigrated to Nantucket from Portugal via the Azores, and his surname is given many different ways. It's listed as Prey on the ship's manifest. It just doesn't sound very Portuguese. Heffernan suggests that Pross is likely a mishearing of the Portuguese surname Braz, B-R-A-Z, which is a quite common name.
That would make sense, at least.
There were 3 mainland Bay Staters from Massachusetts here. 22-year-old Daniel Cook of Boston. He is one who's listed on the manifest as mulatto. I guess for any listeners unaware of that term, that's certainly not a term we would use anymore, but it indicates that someone is mixed race with, probably one black parent and one white parent, or some mix in their background. 23-year-old Holden Henman of Canton, Massachusetts, and Paul Jarrett, age 24, of Barnstable, also listed as mulatto. Connecticut was represented by Jeremiah Ingham, age 17, and William Lay, also age 17, of Saybrook. Like we saw in the Essex, these hometowns are relevant, and they can possibly even contribute to whether someone lives or dies in a survival situation.
Yeah, I think that was really interesting. Like what we talked about before, the difference even between being from Martha's Vineyard versus Nantucket could literally be the deciding factor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we saw it. It was less even with the Essex. It was less even an in the moment thing, but it was more of a predetermined thing. If you were from Nantucket, you were more likely to be selected in the captain's whaleboat, which means you're more likely to be with the captain in the survival situation, and that probably helps your chances overall. So a bit more here from Gregory Gibson on William Lay, who was new to whaling at this point in his life.
He may have been expecting tropical isles and wild adventures, but what he saw when he got to the top of the gangway was a frightening jumble of industrial clutter, the inscrutable mass of the try-works, a grinding wheel, piles of canvas, rope, and chain, strange, cruel-looking hooks and spades, and tubs of potatoes, cabbages, onions, and other perishables strewn across the deck, all under a tent of ropes ascending skyward to the tips of masts as thick as factory chimneys. In his hometown, at the mouth of the Connecticut River, he had seen plenty of schooners and packets, but nothing could have prepared him for the globe.
So a bit there, like we've talked about with even some of these kids who grow up closer to whaling itself, there is that baptism by fire. Your first time on one of these boats, there's all kinds of ropes and cables and chains going everywhere, and you're being yelled at to secure that line over there, and mates and officers who know exactly what they're doing. And especially I think seeing how industrial this is. This is not simply guys on a boat holding harpoons. There's all kinds of machinery, big, dangerous, heavy machinery on board here. So in addition to where they came from on the globe, it's also interesting to see the ages of the crew. The overall average age of the men and boys on board was 19.8 years. If we take the officers out of that, so boat steerers and higher, the age drops to 18.4. I think that's good to keep in mind is when the mutiny itself kicks off, most of these people on board who are not necessarily involved with the mutiny, sort of the bystanders here, are either literal children and or on their first voyage here. Not people that you would expect to be in a position to sort of deal with this or prevent something like this from happening. They're not really in control of their situation here. This is an extremely young crew that we're going to be dealing with, particularly after the mutiny happens. So the Globe rounded Cape Horn on March 5th of 1823 and turned north for Hawaii.
Say that correctly, please.
You signed on in Hawaii, right? So you don't know about Chief Ryback.
George Comstock thought he was Ryback.
Samuel Comstock.
So that's Samuel. That's right.
George is one of those literal children here. George is 14. Right. But yes, I mean, this is a case where
he is an extreme psychopath. He hates officers. He hates America.
So they turn north for Hawaii, citing only one whale the whole way there, despite sailing directly through the famed offshore ground. Which, and again, it could be a seasonal thing. I don't know. But it does say something that this famed whaling ground that's just been discovered not that long before is seemingly empty when they sail through it. So it's either extremely bad luck, or we can see how quickly these whaling grounds get overfished.
Mm-hmm.
So on May 1st, the Globe was off of the big island of Hawaii. In his narrative, George Comstock would note that they were just off of Kealakekua, which he renders as Karakakun, which is where James Cook had been killed.
Truly, like the most beautiful place I've ever been to on Earth. Mind you.
And I don't know if in his narrative, because that narrative is a little shorter, it's included in the Heffernan book.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if he's saying he knew that at the time, that, oh, that's what that is. That's where we are right now. Or if he's looking back at it and saying, oh, this is where
and adding
we were.
Commentary.
It would certainly feel much more eerie, I guess, to know it at the time and sort of feel that foreboding.
Kind of like, is it in the Bounty where the one chief asks how Captain Cook is?
Yes, that is a great scene.
And he's like, he is well.
He's like, I heard that he had been killed by the people of Hawaii. Like, nope.
No.
Nope.
No.
No. That doesn't sound like him. So after spending less than 24 hours in port on Oahu, the Globe set off towards Japan in the company of two other whalers, the Palladium out of Boston and the Pocahontas out of Falmouth. The Globe would separate from her companions after 2 days of sailing and continue on to the Japan grounds. And she would have plenty of company, meeting the whalers Sea Lion, George Porter, Paragon, Phoenix, and Enterprise during her time on the grounds. All of these are Nantucket ships.
I was going to say, no wonder there's no whales left. This is just our contribution. Everyone else is doing it too.
That sort of change in dominance from Nantucket to other whaling ports, it is happening here, but that's not to say that Nantucket is a a failing port. They're still putting out tons of ships out into the Pacific here. I don't know if this is a term we use in the Essex episodes, but the term is gam, where two of these whalers will sort of come up side to side or close enough that they can exchange. You can have people go to each ship. It's a chance for people to socialize. It's a chance for captains to share information, talk a little bit about where they've been, what they've seen, what kind of luck they've been having. So it's during one of these gams, one of these hangout sessions with the Enterprise, that a small but retrospectively very important event took place. Quoting here from Heffernan.
A party from the globe, including third mate Fisher and boatsteerer Comstock, had gone aboard the Enterprise. In a playful mood, which the spirit of the occasion encouraged, Samuel approached Fisher and challenged him to a wrestling match. Fisher was the more athletic of the two, and had no difficulty winning the match. Samuel was enraged and punched Fisher, who easily went after him again and laid him on the deck. "I'll see your heart's blood for this," Samuel said, but Fisher paid no attention to the threat, something that enraged Samuel even more. The humiliation never abated in Samuel's mind.
It mentions Fisher being more athletic of the two. I think it's also maybe the fact that Fisher's the third mate. He's probably been on these whalers for a while. He's probably just like a tough guy. He doesn't even necessarily have to be physically larger or more imposing. He's probably just like a tough guy.
But like also, so does Samuel get mad because he gets his ass beat, basically? Like he starts it and then...
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what happens.
I know this guy. I don't like this guy.
You challenged this guy to wrestling, and then he wins, and you're like, "I'll see your heart's blood for this." Oh yeah, we actually have their heights on here. Fisher is listed at 5'8", and Samuel Comstock is listed at 5'6".
So neither one of them are big by today's standards, but I bet that is a wiry 5'8".
The biggest guy on the boat is actually John Lumbert, the second mate, at 5'11 3/4. They couldn't give him 6.
A tale as old as time.
They couldn't give him 6 feet. Not even his listed height.
He's 5'10", really.
The shortest person, well, this doesn't really count because he's like a literal child, is John Pross at 5'1". But again, he's 14. So
they didn't grow him as big back then, did they?
So during Globe's time in the Japan grounds, there was some dissatisfaction with the quality of the food on board. For a crewman looking for an axe to grind with the captain, this seems like an easy thing to add to the tally of complaints, but the fault does seem to lie mostly with the ship's cook, John Cleveland. Quoting here from Demon of the Waters.
Several men reported problems with the rations. Some of the meat may have been bad, and the manner in which it was served was very irregular. William Lay says that the trouble stemmed from the size of the portions allotted to the crew, the quantity sometimes being more than sufficient for the number of men, and at others not enough to supply the ship's company. Captain Worth again beat Cleveland the cook, this time for being drunk. His drunkenness may have played a part in the food problem.
Here we see like the importance of the cook in this role, in that they have enough food on board. The problem is not that they are running out of food. The problem is that it's being served to them unequally. Like sometimes you get, twice as much as you need, and sometimes you get half as much as you need. And that quote mentions the cook being beaten again.
Yeah.
The previous time had apparently been for a disagreement with Samuel Comstock. And that wasn't the only time a confrontation with Comstock got a crewman punished. Stephen Kidder reported that Constant Lewis was also put in irons for one night after, quote, differing with Comstock the boat steerer.
I guess this is where that hard hierarchy of I officer, you crew member kind of sucks.
Well, it also kind of shows how like Comstock hates authority above him, but loves being able to use it.
This man would have been a correctional officer today.
Yes, perfect. So it would appear that Comstock was high in Captain Worth's favor. Though when Worth's actions warranted grumbling from the crew, it seems that Comstock was more than ready to take advantage of that.
I hate this guy.
He's very
I
weaselly.
hate him.
Yeah.
He's weaseled up to the captain, but the moment he can, like, take advantage of it, he will.
Well, who he reminds me of is Cornelius Hickey from The Terror. That's exactly who I pictured the whole time when I read about this stuff. From William Comstock's narrative, as quoted in Demon of the Waters.
When any man complained to Captain Worth that he was suffering from hunger, he would tell him to eat iron hoops. It does not appear that our hero discountenanced these arbitrary proceedings, but on the contrary, did all he could to encourage them, anticipating effects favorable to his schemes.
It's an interesting position that I feel like Comstock is in, because he's both trying to garner unhappiness with the captain.
Mm-hmm.
He's also taking advantage of his position to get people punished. So it doesn't seem like he would have a lot of pull with the common sailors that he kind of needs on his side.
I mean, I guess if you're looking to not be the guy that gets punished, though, maybe it's worth it to be friends with him, because then when it comes time, it won't be you.
So when the Globe returned to Oahu in November of 1823, 6 of her crew decided that they had had enough of the whaling life for now. These were Daniel Cook, Holden Henman, Jeremiah Ingham, Paul Jarrett, Constant Lewis, and John Pross.
Hell yeah, though. Free trip to Hawaii. Like, I'll stay.
Also, worth noting that of these deserters, none of them, except for Pross, were from Nantucket.
That makes sense.
And even Pross probably didn't really feel that connection to Nantucket, because he wasn't a native born Nantucketer.
I guess that kind of makes sense, because even if maybe you want to, if you're an actual Nantucketer, like, you're potentially like bringing shame to your family.
Oh yeah, that's your whole family line there. Yeah.
Yeah, like there's a lot of social pressure in you not going native or whatever. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. John Cleveland, our cook, he's also listed as being discharged at the same time for his perpetual drunkenness.
So he didn't get a choice but to have a Hawaiian vacation. Yeah. If I was going to get fired, I mean, I'd rather do it there.
Fired for drunkenness in Hawaii. This is like a Jimmy Buffett song. Gibson actually writes that 2 of the escapees were recaptured and put in irons. But William Comstock says that, quote, one of the men having very slender hands slipped his irons and let the other out. Which I'm assuming is implicating John Pross, like the literal child, who maybe the irons were too big for him and being able to get out.
I guess I didn't think about it, that you can't really quit.
Yeah.
Like when it said they had enough, I thought they were just like, see y'all later. But no, like I forgot. Like it's much more like the Navy. Like you can't
not
just
supposed
decide
to.
you're done.
Well, it's like that quote we had at the beginning where it is one of those things where if you lose part, you lose the whole, because you can't really operate the ship the way you need to if you don't have all the people. That being the case, with those, you've lost 7 guys off the ship, you're going to need some replacements. These replacements came in the form of Silas Payne from Sag Harbor, John Oliver.
Hey.
This is an interesting part of the story. We skipped over when it happened. But John Oliver is actually an acquaintance that Samuel had made in Valparaiso, Chile on his previous voyage. So this is a guy that Samuel knows. Could be nothing. Anthony Hansen, who's described as a native from Cape Cod, like a Native American. William Humphreys, a black man from Philadelphia. Thomas Lilliston, a Virginian. He's kind of out of place here.
Yeah, that's definitely out of place for what you'd expect.
Joseph Thomas of Connecticut, and Joe or Joseph Brown, a Hawaiian native. His name is sometimes given in quotes. As, this is likely not his quote-unquote real name, but that's what it's recorded as.
You don't think a native Hawaiian had the name Joe?
Joseph Brown. So what's interesting here is that these guys leave the ship, and then you have this new bunch of guys signing on here. And as I said here, it is a bit not suspicious, because this is something of a brotherhood of whalers, and you're going to know some of the same people. Mm-hmm. You're going to see them in some of the same ports. So that in itself isn't necessarily noteworthy. But William Gibson here, not William Gibson, the sci-fi author, what's his name?
Bob Gibson.
But Gregory Gibson in Demon of the Waters has this to add.
The replacement crew seems so well suited to Samuel Comstock. that the question arises of his involvement in their selection. Could he have driven the men of his watch to leave the ship, and then caused them to be replaced with the men of his own choosing? Comstock had the respect of the captain, and at times he seemed to be able to bend Thomas Worth to his will. Of the 7 men chosen, 5 were involved, at least peripherally, in the mutiny.
So that is kind of the suspicion here, is how much control did Samuel have over these guys?
That's a really good question.
In the article Dangerous Mutinies in the Law, Alastair Couper goes so far as to say that what happens on the globe more resembles an act of piracy rather than a mutiny, given what appears to be pre-planned coordination with the new crew coming on board. Basically the plot of Treasure Island.
Oh, like that goat. I love the little goat guy.
Yeah, exactly.
Muppet Treasure Island.
Yes, for those familiar with Treasure Island or its better version, Muppet Treasure Island, this is literally what Long John Silver does. By having his crew signed on with the ship, and it turns out they're pirates. This is the only source that I saw make that claim with that level of confidence, saying, oh, this is not a mutiny, this is piracy. And in that article, the globe is mentioned only briefly in that chapter. I think you could get into a slippery slope of looking at a long enough time scale. Couldn't you call every mutiny an act of piracy?
Right. I guess it's more like the premeditation of it, though, of if he was actually assembling a crew with a specific goal in mind, then I guess that would be piracy because you're doing it with intent. Whereas I feel like there has to be some element of spontaneity to a mutiny.
Yeah, like only so much pre-planning can go into it. So Lay and Hussey do hint at a certain level of premeditation in their narrative, but suggest that simply getting off the ship was the primary goal.
It didn't sound like it was a very successful hunt. So, yeah, I mean, maybe it is, you want to try to get on board with someone who needs a replacement that you might make more money because they got whales.
So, yeah, our one final quote here from the Lay and Hussey narrative.
Some of the crew were determined to leave the ship, provided she touched at Fanning's Island, and we believe had concerted a plan of escape, but of which the perpetration of a deed chilling to humanity precluded the necessity.
All right, we're going to wrap things there for part 1 because we're almost at 2 hours on the recording. The original plan was to go a little bit further into the story, but I think we'll bundle that into part 2. Stuff is going to start happening fast when we get into part 2. So yeah, any final thoughts on our first part of the mutiny on the Whaleship Globe?
I'm pretty intrigued. I'm actually glad that I did not read or research this very much. I'm very much intrigued for what goes next. I'm definitely glad that I'm familiar with the Essex and stuff first, just kind of knowing what this is all about. But it's interesting to see how differently this is playing out than it would have, with the Essex, where there's probably some stronger leadership at the top. In the Essex situation.
Cool. Well, let's wrap things there. Thank you all for listening, and we will be back fairly soon with our conclusion to the story of the mutiny on the globe.